All right, so I'm PHall, and I'd like to start this off with a question for the audience. So I just want to see a show of hands for who here knows that they have used the national forests in Virginia sometime in their life. All right, so I'm definitely happy to see that number of hands, and everybody who just raised their hands, I think you'll be very interested in this topic I'm about to speak on. And if you didn't raise your hands, I hope I can spark some interest in you, or maybe get you thinking more about going outside and enjoying nature, or maybe thinking a little bit more about how you can help the environment. So as you can see, my topic is forest roads, but I want to start off just giving you an idea of what the deal is in Virginia with their national forests. So this is just a map of the national forests in the whole United States, and here are Virginia's national forests. And we have two national forests in Virginia, the Jefferson National Forest and the Washington National Forest. And these two combined actually make up the largest area of national forest in one state to the east of the Mississippi River. So in Virginia, the national forests are actually a pretty big deal for us. And the and so far, I've found that national forests are actually like a lot more important to the general public than I'd expected. So this actually leads into what my internship was. And right here, this is Misty Bose. She is the director of Wild Virginia, which is a nonprofit organization based in Charlottesville. And they use advocacy and public outreach to connect with clearly the public and the Forest Service. They're actually very close with the Forest Service and communicate with them a lot. And right here, this is David Sly. He's the lead conservationist for Wild Virginia, and he actually does most of the he talks to the Forest Service and politicians. So he does a lot of the more official outreach for Wild Virginia, while Misty organizes more volunteer-based things. And these are actually the only two paid employees of the organization. So it's a really volunteer-based place to work at. So when I got there, wasn't quite sure what I'd be doing, but they ended up assigning me with the topic of research of trying to figure out, are there any better ways to decrease the amount of invasive species that become prevalent when a forest road is decommissioned? And as I went through my research for this, it was really hard to find any sources that were just specifically on this. I found sources that referenced the decommissioning of forest roads, but not ones that were very specific on this topic. So I did a write-up with everything that I could find that was specific to this, but then I wanted to broaden the topic for my actual Verbix research. So I went on to research forest roads and how they affect the ecosystem around them, and what's the best way to decrease their adverse effects. So what I decided to do was go out into the forests and find forest roads and set up transects across them. And you might be able to see it here. There's a blue line going across, but I put arrows there just to give you an idea of where it is. And what a transect is, the one that I was using, it's a 20-yard string that's split into 4 5-yard increments. And for each increment, there's a certain amount of width that I go out from that. So I was using my the notebook that I was recording my data in. That was the length that I went out from the string. So it was about, here's the string, it was about to here. That's about how far out I was going. And I look at the ground and above me and look for any living organism that's in that area. And then I record all the data that I find. And I do that for every section on one side of the transect and then every section on the other side. And I did this to try and see if forest roads actually do, if they do introduce invasive species to the national forest in Virginia, and to see like if they do, how much they really do, and if it's affecting the amount of native plants that are growing in the area. And this is right here, this is a picture of the notebook that I was recording my data in. And it might be a little unclear and hard to read, but even if you had it in front of you, it would probably still be hard to read just because of my handwriting. And right here, this is a picture of a redback salamander that I found. And I just found this to be really interesting because one of the sources I found actually talked about how forest roads can impede on the migration patterns of the redback salamander. And that was written by a professor at Washington and Lee University. And later on, I actually met that professor while I was there touring around the school, but I didn't realize that it was him. And once we got to talking, I found out that like he was the actual person that wrote that. So I just thought that was really interesting that I met somebody that wrote one of the sources that I used. And this is a picture of the best moment that I had during my internship, because while I was out there, I'd been out there for about 4 hours, just mostly counting lots of plants, like hundreds of plants. So it gets pretty tedious. So once I was done, I just went on a walk down the road, and I found this big rock formation on the side. So I figured that I had to climb up to the top. So once I got to the top, there was just this beautiful view. So that was just a great way to like end the day of long, hard counting plants. So now I'll be getting on to my community service part. So I also did my community service with Wild Virginia because they're a nonprofit and they do a lot of volunteer work. So I'm assuming most of you probably recognize the no pipeline sign, and Wild Virginia actually has a lot to do with that sign. So right here, you can see me sitting in the back. I'm tabling with Wild Virginia at the Red Wing Roots Festival, and at that moment I was sitting back there dealing with money and pamphlets on the table, while the other two people were out talking to people, trying to get them to come to our tent. So what we were doing at the tent is we had a petition that people could sign to have a citizens advisory panel with the governor, and what the topic of that would be was his current stance on renewable energy and how he's been saying that he'll be promoting renewable energy, but his actions haven't necessarily shown that. So we just wanted to try and get a chance to talk to him about that and figure out what's happening. And we also had a sign-up sheet for the March on the Mansion, it ended up being a small rally at the governor's house where people went there to try and get him to come talk to them about current environmental problems in Virginia. And sadly, I wasn't able to attend that. And also, it ended up being that he wasn't home that day, so it was kind of a bust. But I like that they did that, just because it shows that they really care about the environment and they want to talk to politicians about it. And then this right here is a flyer for the Wild and Scenic Film Festival, which actually just recently happened in Charlottesville. And Wild Virginia has put this on for the past few years. And this year they actually sold out in Charlottesville fairly quickly. And I was tasked with the job of advertising in Charlottesville and trying to get people to buy tickets for it. And this poster right here, it's actually in my mom's bus because she drives the bus for UVA. So I thought that it would be a good idea to target UVA students because they live so close to where the film festival was going on, and they're definitely a good audience to target for something like this, because soon enough they'll be going out into the real world and like getting big jobs and a lot of them will be getting jobs that have to do with the environment. So it's good to educate the UVA students on this, especially since they're so close to so many organizations like this. So that's basically what I did for a majority of my community service. I also attended some meetings and gave ideas on how we could involve Wild Virginia in educating children in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, because they have been doing a little bit of that, but they want to get into it more. So we actually managed to start having some classes to train people that want to work with Wild Virginia with education. So they've been doing one of those classes about once each month. So we've actually started getting that going. I don't think there have been any solid plans for which schools will be working with yet, but I know there's an environmental club in Albemarle High School, and I know that they have connections with Wild Virginia. So I'm assuming that they'll be working with Albemarle quite a bit. So this is basically all I did for volunteer work. So now I'll be getting on to my actual research for Verbigs. So right here, this is a forest road crossing a creek, and the culvert was made incorrectly, so it's washing it out, and this is causing erosion and sedimentation. And these two things, if they occur in a creek, then it causes decreased dissolved oxygen levels, because the plants that are living in the creek that create oxygen that goes into the water, they're being killed because they can't get light if there's sedimentation, because that's covering all the leaves, so they can't perform photosynthesis. And with decreased dissolved oxygen levels, that means that all life in the creek will start to decline, just because oxygen is required by most of the organisms that are living in the water. And not only is erosion like this a big problem with forest roads, also hydrology comes into play when it's raining and the forest road is built on a slope, because the slope, it just naturally goes down, but the forest road adds a flat spot in there. So then when it starts to rain, the water pools up on top, and there's also subsurface pooling. So that means that less water is going to go down the hill on the other side. So organisms over there will be receiving less nutrients and water. So some of the ways that I found that could help reduce these adverse effects is for the creek crossings like this. I actually found that the Forest Service has put some money towards adding different pipes in, because right here you can see there are multiple pipes going through. But what works better is if there's just one steel arch that goes over the creek, so that way there won't be any problem with the movement of organisms in the water. They can just freely pass through, and also it makes it easier to build a stable culvert. And also planting trees, or just like any plants really around the crossing, just stabilizes the soil, so that makes it a little harder for it to erode. So then right here, this is Japanese stiltgrass, and this is actually a big problem in our national forests now, because it's been introduced. It was introduced years ago, but now it's really starting to spread throughout the forests. And the forest roads are actually where a lot of it enters the forest, because when a forest road is constructed or decommissioned, they typically seed the top of it, so that way it'll decrease erosion, just because it increases the structural integrity of the soil. And the net-like nature of the roots of Japanese stiltgrass, they are great for stabilizing soil, but it also chokes out other native plants that are living in the area. And in one of the sources that I used for my research, they actually found that where there was Japanese stiltgrass growing, the productivity of native plants dropped by 60%. So that's a really huge decrease for the native plants in an ecosystem. And what I found for probably the best way of keeping the Japanese stiltgrass out would just be, when the forest roads are seeded, using native plants would definitely be the best way to avoid this. And when I was laying my transects and counting the plants that were on the road, I actually found that there was a lot of a plant called wild plantain. It was growing on the road, and there was, in some spots, there was nearly as much of that as there was Japanese stiltgrass. So that would be a great thing to plant on the roads to stabilize the soil, because clearly it's a good environment for that to grow, and it'll do the same job as the Japanese stiltgrass would, but it won't have any harmful effects on the environment around the road. So I also have some larger solutions for this, And funding is definitely the biggest solution because right now the Forest Service is very underfunded by the government. And I talked with my mentor, Misty, and she said that probably the biggest problem that the Forest Service faces is their severe underfunding. And in one of the Forest Road reports from 2001, I found that they had an $8.1 billion backlog in maintenance costs for forest roads alone. And that number is twice what their budget is this year. And that was in 2001 was their backlog costs. So that's 16 years. So I'm assuming that cost to the backlog has definitely increased just because if it was already double what their budget is now, it has to have increased by now. And so definitely government funding is it's absolutely necessary for the Forest Service to continue to keep our forests in good condition and be able to maintain what they've already put in place. And then the next solution, it leads right back to what my volunteer work was. Just public advocacy and just getting the word out. Because if nobody knows about issues that are happening, then nothing's actually going to happen about those issues. So once more people know about what problems are going on in our national forests, then there's a much higher chance that they'll actually speak their minds about that. And then politicians in this area will hear what the people are saying. And if like there's a really large majority of people saying that they want more funding for the Forest Service, then it's likely that the politicians here will push towards that, because if they don't, then it's likely that they might not be reelected. So so just a lot of advocacy and getting the word out is really probably the best way to actually achieve that increased funding that the Forest Service needs. So in the future, I'll be attending Washington and Lee University, and I plan to major in environmental studies. Once I get there, we'll see what happens, but hopefully I really like environmental studies there. I really like all the faculty that I've met so far in that program, so I think I'll really enjoy it. And if I were to give advice to rising seniors in Burbigs, I just have to say that if you choose an internship that you really love, then it's going to be a really fun project for you, because you'll just be able to go out and do what you love for hours. And sure, there are requirements, but if you really love it, then the requirements don't even matter, because you'll want to do more than what's required. And it's just also, it'll be really enjoyable for the whole project, because I really enjoyed this presentation just because I really like my topic and I'm able to talk to people about it and get the word out. And that happens to be one of my solutions, is just getting the word out. So if you choose something you really love, it'll be a great time. So that's all. Any questions?
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering how you learned about like field testing techniques and like how to identify species, the species that you were.
Mostly because for 7 years I've been going to this place called Nature Camp. It's out near Lexington, Virginia, and like I just really love it there. And that's how I actually just had learned about transects a few months before I got this internship. And when I had talked to David, the conservationist there, like he was surprised that I knew about all that stuff. So he was just like, "Wow, this is great! Like you go, Philip, go do that." So yeah, I've just been learning a lot about like how to identify species and how to do field tests in Nature Camp. So that's how I learned about all that.
This is more of a statement, but I would be very surprised if you didn't enjoy environmental science in college,
Yeah.
because I know you're a huge advocate.
You mentioned about working hours in the forest. Did you work by yourself? Or?
Yeah, I was out by myself when I was out there doing that. I kind of liked it. It was nice just being out there.
There's no cell service. Where were you?
I was I was near Shenandoah, so I was there. It's sometimes there is.
Sorry.
There was right where I hiked up. So.
Only recently got a smartphone, am I wrong?
Yeah, actually, I just got a smartphone like a month ago.
If I could make an observation over last few presentations, it seems like there's this common theme of we're short on funding and we got to do something about the government, and we got to put as a guy who's part of a nonprofit and you're part of a nonprofit, and I would say to everyone, don't forget that part of your existence, because I think that's where a lot of the solutions are going to have to come from. There's only so much money to go around, but maybe if you thought about, in this case, you've got a culvert that probably the Forest Service put in there, even though they might have thought they were doing a good thing. But if a bridge is a better idea, then find the money to build a bridge.
Yeah.
You know, so no more.
Yeah, that's
proselytizing.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot of what Wild Virginia does. Like, Misty spends a lot of her time just writing grants. Like, she writes grant proposals for a lot of different companies, just trying to get money to go towards projects.
I think part of the idea of urban community service is that you guys understand the importance of nonprofits, because, your job, many of you will work in service field in your job, but a lot of the things that we provide and a lot of the solutions in American companies, nonprofits, and those happen after hours, and it only happens because people are committed. So that was part of the goal of why you had to work with a not-for-profit, so that you got that experience and saw the importance and relevance of that, and making effective changes.
So do you know what exactly you want to do with your environmental science degree? Like what career?
I want to do field research, and my parents, when they were in Costa Rica, they actually met a couple that lived out there, and they do water testing in a lake. And one of them, she's actually pretty high up in this company that does a lot of, they do a lot with field research with ecosystems. And she said that, like, just having this background with, like, already going out there and doing some field research, that already, like, gives me a really big boost for, like, having a chance at getting a job like that. So that was really exciting, because, like, that's what I want to do.